Welcome back, everyone. Good to be with you again. This is the seventh in my series, uh, Free Grace, Easy Believism, Proof Text, Spurious Proof Text, Debunked. This is number 7 in the series, I believe. Romans 4, de-Protestantized. And that's exactly what we need Romans 4 to be, de-Protestantized. You're going to see why in a few minutes. But the main criticism against me and my channel is that I'm something of a crank. I'm not going with the scholarship. I'm not simply consulting the lexicon and accepting as gospel all the translations that are in there. I'm actually examining the context. I'm questioning things. But everybody thinks that it's just YouTube Charlie Michaels against the world. Well, actually, I'm part of a school of thought. It's called the New Perspective on Paul, and we challenge the sola fideists, who are always claiming that it's all about thinking the correct, warm, and fuzzy thoughts about Jesus. That's all you ever had to do to get to heaven, is think those correct, warm, and fuzzies. And the descendants of the sola fideists are the free grace fools, the Calvitards, the Lutholaters. Well, the New Perspective on Paul, since at least the early 1970s with E.P. Sanders, has been challenging that paradigm, and we have been making some progress. I say we, I actually don't deserve to be included in that elite group of academics who have done such a wonderful job of debunking sola fide. Let me introduce you to a few of them. Stand by here. Yes, your humble YouTube correspondent here really does not deserve to be mentioned in the same breath as these worthies. We're talking about workers like Dennis R. Lindsay of Bushnell, N.T. Wright of Oxford, who's basically a living legend at this point, Richard B. Hayes, Duke Divinity, Douglas A. Campbell, Kevin Grasso, Matthew W. Bates, who wrote that book, Salvation by Allegiance Alone. Others could be mentioned too, like N.K. Gupta. There are at least half a dozen other worthies, just like these gentlemen. So Charlie Michaels here is not a complete crank. He belongs to this school called the New Perspective on Paul. And we understand that Paul, the ex-Pharisee, when he talks about works, works is not a synonym for the golden rule. Works is actually about things that are prescribed by the Torah, like attending the 3 annual festivals, like being circumcised, like atoning for sin at the temple on Yom Kippur. These are what works meant to an ex-Pharisee like Paul. Works to the sola fideist mean anything and everything you do outside of your mind in an attempt to please God. Well, the New Perspective on Paul challenges that rubbish and challenges it quite effectively. And we also challenge the idea that the pistis word group can only be talking about mental activity. Wrong. Faith, as that pistis noun is routinely and reflexively translated, faith, that can also mean faithfulness. And it does mean faithfulness. It depends on the context. But it is translated, the same word, pistis, is translated faithfulness in Matthew 23:23, Romans 3:3, Galatians 5:22, and arguably it should have been in a lot other places too. I'll put this down for a moment here. So today, armed with my New Perspective on Paul friends and my background, let me tell you a little bit about my background here too. This year marks the 20th anniversary of my first seminary program, which was here in New York City. And one of the first courses I took, graduate courses, was on the book of Romans. And if I recall, the professor was a fellow named Shelrud. And this this seminary here, which I'm struggling to remember the name of for some reason. It was the only accredited seminary in New York City. And unfortunately, even though I knew they had a liberal bent, it was either that or, giving up the idea entirely. Eventually, I went to Liberty University. I transferred a year later, but I started out with this New York City seminary. And Professor Shelroot gave a class on Romans that fall. And I had some difficulty getting past the section Romans chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, which is clearly talking about works. And I could not reconcile that passage with the rest of the idea, which was all about trusting. And again, this was a typical Protestant type of evangelical seminary. And, they take it for granted that faith, the default meaning of faith, is always about mental activity. Well, I couldn't reconcile that with Romans 2, 5 through 11, and I still can't. So today, I'm going to take you through Romans chapter 4. And we're going to de-Protestantize it. We're going to understand what Paul was actually trying to say without the Protestant filters, which you and I have been reading Romans 4 through Protestant filters our whole lives. And that's why we don't understand it. That's why the New Testament seems to be talking out of both sides of its mouth all the time, because our English Bibles have been filtered through Protestant ideology. And it's defeated the whole purpose. So today, I'm going to take you through Romans 4, and we're going to de-Protestantize. Stand by. I hope you can forgive my informal attire here, but it's an unusually warm day here in the Boogie Down Bronx. So rather than put my AC on over here, which is kind of noisy, I thought for the sake of sound quality, I'll simply just dress comfortably. Okay, sorry if you have a problem with that. I don't wear collars all the time. And it's like 85 degrees here. Not that we're complaining, Lord. I'm just saying here, it's 85 degrees. So forgive me if I'm wearing, a sleeveless shirt. Not a big deal, is it? Okay. I actually had somebody complain to me about that one time. I posted my video on Facebook. I was wearing something like this. And he came on and said, never give a Bible lesson wearing something like that. I'm like, okay, yeah, don't worry about it. Next time I'll wear something. But you know what? What's the difference? At least I'm wearing this, okay? Be thankful for that. Okay, I need you to understand something here. I'm not going to, as in the previous 6 videos in this series, I went into extensive definitions of the pistis word family. Pistis, the noun, 4102, which gets translated faith. It can also mean faithfulness. It depends on the context. I went into at-length discussions about this noun and how it gets translated and why it was translated faith in some places, which is ambiguous. But even in English, faith is a noun. It's not talking about mental activity. It's talking about a quality, talking about a thing, faith, fidelity. It's either sincerity or it's confidence, but it's a thing. It's not an action, faith. Whenever you see that noun in the New Testament, remember, it is a noun. It's not a verb talking about trust. It's not. That's a verb. Trust is a verb. Faith is a thing. All right. So, here I am. I'm already doing this again. I don't want to get into lengthy definitions about the pistis noun or the verb which is derived from that noun, which is pistuo. That's 4100 in Strong's. That is the action of the noun pistis. And again, this noun pistis, depending on the context, it means either confidence or it means fidelity, faithfulness. It depends on the context. And the same thing with the verb pistuo. It gets translated believe. it's also context dependent. And if you don't see the content of the belief, it's not talking about credence, it's talking about allegiance, it's talking about obedience. If you have any doubt about this, have a look at some of the previous videos in this series. I have a link to the playlist in the description of this video. Go there. If you really have any doubts that the pistis noun that gets translated faith, this koine noun, transliterated pistis, which in English translates into the English word faith. It's a noun. But we've been trained since our first weeks at Sunday school to think it's a verb talking about trust. No, it's a noun. Okay. And also, again, the verb that does get derived from this noun, pisteuo, that is also context dependent. If you have any doubt about this, please have a look at some of the videos that I've done in this series. I go into this, I think in all 6 of them, I have PowerPoint slides. I describe why these words are context dependent. Here, I'm going to do this discussion on Romans chapter 4 with some preliminary discussions of the parts of the letter to the Romans, putting them in context before we get to Romans 4. Here, I'm going to assume that you understand that this word that gets translated faith can also mean faithfulness, and it's context dependent. Now, this first, I'm going to give you the first example of what I'm talking about. Romans 1:8. Paul says, first, put this here. Paul's telling the church at Rome, first, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith, and I add the fullness here. In blue, I'm adding what it should have been, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. Let me put this down for a moment. Why would the mental activity of the Roman church be spoken of throughout the whole world? Well, of course, it's not the mental activity, the warm and fuzzy thoughts about Jesus that is being spoken of throughout the whole world. No. Paul is talking about the fidelity to King Jesus, despite the incredible persecution that this church is under. Now, remember, this is a church located in the capital city of the empire that put Jesus, the Christ, to death for insurrection. And here you have a group of people, some 20, 25 years later, who are worshiping this executed criminal, someone that the empire dealt out its harshest possible punishment, death on the cross. And this group of Christians are worshiping someone who's been put to death by the empire. You don't think that would be a little bit risky? Yeah. It would be like somebody today in let's say Gaza worshiping Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. Okay. As far as they were concerned, they would be worshiping an enemy. So when Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verse 8, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world, he's not talking about their ability to suspend disbelief and actually believe that Jesus has come back to life after being executed. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about your ability to persevere, despite the fact that within 10 years of my letter, half of you are going to be lighting up the Roman sky as torches. Okay, because that is what the Emperor Nero is going to do with half of the readers of this letter to the Romans. Within 10 years, these people are going to be used as torches. They're going to be blamed for the fire that destroys Rome, the Christians. And so Christians are going to be executed. They're already being persecuted. Pretty soon, they're going to be threatened with annihilation. So when Paul says in Romans 1:8, your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world, Again, he's talking about their courage, their fidelity. Have to keep that in mind because when we go to Romans 4:5, when it talks about being rewarded for faith, again, it's not talking about warm and fuzzy mental activity. It's talking about fidelity. Stand by. All right, before we get into the actual text, let me give you a little bit of background about this whole controversy here. All right. So, Protestants for the last 500 years have looked at Romans chapter 3 and Romans chapter 4, and wherever they see the word faith, they're assuming that Paul is talking about belief in the gospel message. They're not talking about staying true to King Jesus, despite the fact that you're about to be lit up like torches in the night sky. No, as far as Protestants, 1,500 years removed and a continent removed, they believe faith, when we see this word faith in Romans chapter 3, Romans chapter 4, it must be talking about belief, confidence in the gospel message, that it's actually true. Well, you know what? Paul didn't need faith to believe the gospel message was actually true. Paul knew it was true. And there were enough living witnesses who saw Jesus alive after his crucifixion to know it was true, to verify that this story was true. These people at that time are moving in the gifts of the Spirit, as Romans chapter 8 indicates, and some of other Paul's letters indicate. In fact, in his own letter, in this letter to the Romans, Paul in chapter 15 says his ministry has been proven by miracles. Romans 15, 19, 18, and 19. He says, everywhere he has went to proclaim the gospel of Jesus, his word has been attested by signs and wonders. All right. He's not demanding anybody suspend disbelief, make a faith commitment to anything. He's showing everyone the gospel is true. The church at Rome surely knew the gospel was true. They're not going to risk their lives the way they are right now unless they know the gospel is true. So when Paul in Romans chapter 4 is talking about faith, he's not someone who is 1,500 years and a continent removed from the resurrection. Paul has seen the risen Christ with his own eyes. The people he's writing to are moving in the gifts of the Spirit. They are seeing the supernatural in real life. These are not skeptics, post-Renaissance skeptics who are hardcore rationalists. No. Okay. These people have no problem believing that Jesus actually rose from the dead. These people have no problem believing the gospel narrative. Their challenge is to stay true to a despised and executed political leader because it meant their own lives and the lives of their children. Faith to these people was staying true to Jesus despite the persecution. And that's what it's going to mean to us not all that long from now. Mark my words. And that's why I'm doing this. You want to know. You really want to know why I'm doing this series? So I'm here to tell you that we're coming into a time like Paul lived in. And it's not going to be about whether we believe the story is true. It's going to be about whether we have the fidelity to King Jesus. That is what will save us. Not our belief in an old story. Not our willingness or our ability to suspend disbelief. No, it's going to be about our fidelity to King Jesus, just like it was in the first century, just like it was to the people Paul is writing to. Now I want to get to the text. I want to start with the end of chapter 3. So you understand Romans chapter 4. Again, any text that's taken out of context is a pretext. So I'm going to look at the last 10 verses of Romans chapter 3, and then we're going to go into Romans chapter 4. Now I have put in this text here, which is somewhat my own translation. It's also New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. I've made a few changes here and there. The changes I made are in blue, and I have helpful information in red inside of brackets. The text itself is in black. Okay, so the original text in black, my changes in blue. Keep that in mind as we go forward, okay? I think you'll see that my changes are more than justified. Stand by. So as I said, before we get into Romans chapter 4, to understand what Paul's talking about, you got to go up a little bit in the letter to Romans chapter 3. I'm saying the last 11 verses should be sufficient to give us a real feel for what he's talking about when we get to Romans chapter 4. So let's go through these 11 verses together, and then we'll get into Romans 4 itself. But again, you need to understand what he's talking about prior to Romans 4. Otherwise, you're not going to get it. Now, as I say here, I have de-Protestantized this text. And you will see my changes are in blue. I have some helpful information in the brackets in red. Let's go through it. All right, so 321. But now, apart from the law of Moses, you see how I added of Moses in red there? Okay. A lot of people think the law is a synonym for the golden rule. It's not. Paul is an ex-Pharisee, someone who studied the law of Moses. Talking about the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That is the law of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, the most authoritative to Jews. But now, apart from the law of Moses, the righteousness of God has been disclosed and is attested by both the law of Moses. I should put this in red. Why I didn't do that earlier, I'm going to do that now. Yes, attested by the law of Moses and the prophets. Who are the prophets? Isaiah, Ezekiel, that book of the 12 prophets too, from Malachi to Joel, etc. The Tanakh, the Jewish Old Testament, the scriptures. You have histories like 1st and 2nd Samuel, Kings. It's divided into 3 main parts: the law, the prophets, and the historical books. It's also the wisdom literature too, you can add into that. Sometimes that's included with the histories. But Paul is saying the righteousness of God has been disclosed and is attested by both the law of Moses and the prophets. What he's saying here is that both of these scriptures, these categories of scripture, they are attesting to Jesus, to King Jesus. Both the law of Moses and the prophets have been talking about Jesus. That's what he's saying here, Romans 3:21, 22. The righteousness of God through the faithfulness of Jesus, the Christ. Not everybody knows what the Christ means. Well, it means the anointed by God. Through the faithfulness of Jesus, the Christ. Why faithfulness and not faith? Well, faith is ambiguous. Again, it's not talking about the confidence of Jesus. It's talking about the fidelity of Jesus, obviously. The Son who goes to the cross. Once again, let's go back up again. God, through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, for all who believe him. You see how I have obey him next to believe? Why? Well, do you see the content of the belief? anywhere there? No. This is what I was saying before. This verb pisteuo gets translated believe. The Protestants didn't want to go with works. They wanted to keep visible external actions out of the salvation plan. So they changed obey for all who obey. They changed that to all who believe. But they don't, again, Paul doesn't say what to believe. You have to eisegete what it is they're going to believe. And I've said this in the other videos. If you don't see the content of the belief, this verb that gets translated believe is not talking about credence, it's talking about allegiance. So it should be all who obey. And then Paul says here, well, there is no distinction between Jew and Gentile. We know that from what comes above. There is no distinction between Jew and Gentile. Verse 23, since all have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. Well, most of us have remembered that verse, haven't we? Verse 24, they, that means the Gentiles and the Jews, they are now justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in, actually by, Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by or with his blood, effective through faithfulness to King Jesus. Now, again, why do I say faithfulness here? Well, look at it the other way, effective through faith. What are we talking about? Effective through faith. Does he say faith in what? No, you have to eisegete it. But if I say faithfulness, you don't have to eisegete anything, do you? It's perfectly clear. Effective through faithfulness. And of course, to King Jesus. Okay. He, God, did this to demonstrate God's righteousness. Actually, how benign God actually is. Because in his divine forbearance, God had passed over the sins of rebellion against him, previously committed. And verse 26 is one of the most important verses, really, in the entire New Testament. It was to demonstrate at the present time his own righteousness, God's own righteousness, meaning his own goodness, so that he is righteous, really good, and he justifies the one. Watch this carefully. He justifies the one who has the faithfulness of Jesus. Again, how would you read it? He justifies the one who has the faith of Jesus. What does that mean? The faith of Jesus. Are we talking about Jesus believing something? No. Obviously, we're not talking about Jesus's mental activities. No. We're talking about Jesus's willingness to sacrifice his own self on the cross, obviously, who has the faithfulness of Jesus. That is the one whom God is justifying. Let's go up there again. I may have made this too big. I should have perhaps made the text a little smaller so we can get the whole thing on a single page. In any case, so that he is righteous, God is righteous, and he justifies the one who has the faithfulness of Jesus. So anyone who has the fidelity to Jesus that Jesus has to the Father is the one who will be justified. Again, if you were to take this to mean simply faith, he justifies the one who has the faith of Jesus. What does that mean? He believes certain things about Jesus? What things? How come you're not telling us? If what Paul is saying here, that God justifies someone who has the correct conclusions about Jesus, well, what are they? And why aren't you telling them? It's so important. You're saying he justifies the one who has the right Christology, the right theory of Jesus? No, obviously not. He's talking about who has the faithfulness of Jesus, who has the selflessness of Jesus. Jesus does everything the Father tells him. He is faithful to the Father. Verse 27. Then what becomes of boasting? Paul is talking about what becomes of, how can I boast about my righteousness through the law, through Moses' law? And Paul says it is excluded. He can't boast. Through what kind of law? That of works, like Moses' works. And what kind of works are we talking about? We're not talking about helping little old ladies across the street. No, he's talking about ritual sacrifices. He's talking about honoring the Passover, honoring the festival of booths, circumcising your male son. These are the sort of works that an ex-Pharisee like Paul is talking about. He's not talking about being nice to your neighbor. It's not the context here. That goes with it, I guess, but it's really not what an ex-Pharisee is talking about. All right, no, rather through the law of faithfulness. This is what you can boast about. This is what justifies. Through the law of faithfulness to King Jesus, obviously. Verse 28, Romans 3:28. For we now hold that a person is justified by faithfulness, not by mental activity, but by faithfulness to King Jesus, apart from works prescribed by the law of Moses, like ritual animal sacrifices at the temple on Yom Kippur. Okay, so what does he say here? We now hold that a person is justified by faith apart from works prescribed by the law. Works prescribed by the law are numerous. They're in the Torah. They tell you what animals to sacrifice on what days. Paul, the ex-Pharisee, is saying, no, that's not how we're justified. We're justified to faithfulness to King Jesus. Just like King Jesus was faithful to his Father, our fidelity to King Jesus is what will justify us, not our fidelity to the works of the law of Moses. All right. Verse 29, or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? So he's saying, it's not just the Jews. The Jews had the law of Moses, but the Gentiles, they have to have a way to be righteous too. And what is that? It's faithfulness to King Jesus, just like the Jews. Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one, and he will justify the circumcised on the ground of faithfulness. The circumcised are Jews. On the ground of faithfulness to King Jesus, and uncircumcised through that same faithfulness. Again, if you're not saying faithfulness, what are you saying? Are you saying through their ologies, through their soteriology, through their, I don't know, whatever story, whatever parts of the gospel message they think are necessary to believe? No. We know it's faithfulness because there is no content of the faith described, is there? Do you see any content of the faith? No. You don't need content, belief content, if it's talking about allegiance, not credence. Understand that. If you understand that, you're well on your way to understanding Romans 3 and Romans 4. Do we then overthrow the law? Obviously, the law of Moses. What other law is he talking about? The law of Moses, of course. Through this faithfulness to King Jesus rather than to Moses' law. That's what he's talking about. Do we overthrow the law through this faith? Yeah. By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. We uphold the law of Moses because it points us to Jesus, the Messiah. That's what he's saying. You don't have to throw the Old Testament out the window. You're not throwing the law of Moses out the window. You're using the law of Moses to show you how we are righteous with God by obeying God's Son, the Messiah. The Messiah is pointed to in the law of Moses. And at last, Romans 4. All right, so let me put this down for a moment. I hope you understand where I'm going with this by now. Okay, this noun that gets translated faith It's not talking about mental activity. It's not talking about suspending disbelief and actually subscribing to all those wonderful gospel stories. Now, 1,500 years after this letter was written, people like Luther and Calvin, maybe they felt, hey, you know what? I need to be rewarded for believing stories about how 5,000 people could be fed from a couple of fish and a few loaves of bread. God should reward me for believing such a story. But this is not the sort of faith that Paul is talking about, is it? Certainly not in the context here. No. And Paul, in Romans chapter 4, is not going to do a 180-degree turn and start talking about mental activity with Abraham. What he's going to do in Romans chapter 4, he's going to use an example of a patriarch who existed before the law of Moses existed. Moses' law comes many hundreds of years after Abraham lived. Abraham lived around 1800 BC. The law of Moses comes anywhere from 1400 to 1200 BC. So it's about 500 years before Moses is even born, we have Abraham. So Paul is going to use the patriarch Abraham to describe how somebody can be righteous with God without the law. Because the law of Moses does not exist when Abraham is alive. So how does Abraham become righteous with God without the law telling him what animals to sacrifice on what days, what festivals to keep throughout the year? How can you be righteous? Paul's going to show you how you be righteous, like Abraham was, because Abraham obeyed God. Okay, now we read this word that gets translated faith in Romans chapter 4. We're going to read this as if it's talking about trust. But again, there is no content of the trust. It doesn't describe what Abraham was believing in, what he's trusting in. It never says. You will not see that in Romans chapter 4. There is no content. But there doesn't have to be content if faith is, like Romans 3 and Romans 1:8, talking about fidelity. And that's exactly what it is talking about in Romans 4. Because if you read the Genesis account of the life of Abraham, you will see that there are several times that Abraham does not always believe God. In Romans chapter 12, or I should say Genesis chapter 12, Abraham doubts that he's going to get out of Pharaoh's house alive, and he tries to pass his wife off as his sister. Now, if Abraham believed that his offspring were going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky, why would he do that? Well, obviously, he didn't trust God to protect his wife, by whom all this progeny would come. Also, we see in Genesis chapter 16, Abraham and his wife Sarai, they have abandoned all hope of having the offspring that God promised them. And they are now recruiting their Egyptian slave Hagar to help them have an heir. Because late in life, Abraham doesn't have an heir. He's going to have to give his possessions to his slaves. No, they take Hagar and they have a child by her, Ishmael, who becomes the founder of the tribes that we call Arabs today, Ishmael. This is in Genesis chapter 16. So we see in the story of Abraham, the Genesis story of Abraham, we see that he does not always believe God. But you will not find anywhere in the story of Genesis a place where Abraham disobeys God. He doesn't always believe, but he always obeys. And you know, that is a sign of faithfulness. That is fidelity. Sometimes we're under authority and we don't always understand what it is we're told to do, and yet we do it anyway. That's fidelity. And that's why Abraham was called faithful. Abraham is faithful. He's not credulous. He's obedient. And that's what Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 4. I'm going to show you as quickly as I can. Stand by. So Romans 4, deprotestantized. I've reduced the font here quite a bit so that we can get a lot more on one page. I'm sorry if I confused you a little bit with Romans chapter 3 there. I think I made it just a little bit too big, and it was hard to follow, the sentences. So I think this is a better solution here. But again, I have deprotestantized this chapter. I have put in red, in brackets in red, information that I believe will help you understand this chapter. The part that is in blue, in the dark blue, these are the changes I have made to the text. Basically, I've changed faith, which is ambiguous, and which we've all been trained to think is talking about mental activity, trust. I put it in the noun that it really should be, which is faithfulness. Okay? We're not talking about the adjective faithful. That's a separate adjective. That's G4103, pistos. No, pistis. We're talking about faithfulness. And once again, this is one of the possible denotations of that word pistis, which gets translated faith, which even in English is a noun meaning fidelity. Okay, so let's just go through it here. By the way, I'm saying Romans 4, deprotestantized. I wish we had a New Testament that was deprotestantized. I'm in a THM program now. I'm thinking maybe when I'm finished with that 2 years from now, or hopefully less, maybe I will start to deprotestantize some of these texts. We'll see. Something to think about. Let me get to it. This is already a long video, isn't it? All right, so Romans 4 and verse 1. What then are we to say was gained by Abraham, our ancestor, according to the flesh? In other words, according to what he did. For if Abraham was justified by works, and again, works here is not a synonym for the golden rule, folks. Works to an ex-Pharisee like Paul, it's talking about ritual sacrifice at the temple. It's talking about honoring the Passover. It's talking about circumcision. These are the works of the Mosaic law. And again, he's not going to repeat law of Moses, works of the law of Moses. He's not going to repeat it every time he uses that word works, ergon. People understand what an ex-Pharisee is talking about. We don't understand. Half of us don't understand, but I'm telling you, Paul here is talking about works of the law of Moses. But he's showing the absurdity that somebody who lived before the law of Moses was even there, he could not have been justified by works. So he's saying, what is it that justifies Abraham? That's what this chapter is exploring. Romans chapter 4, what exactly justified Abraham? Now, we evangelicals have been taught what justified Abraham was his willingness to suspend disbelief about something. But nobody can ever tell you what it was Abraham believed in, and nobody can tell you why it is that God would consider simple-minded credulity a virtue. Since when is gullibility a virtue? Never, of course. But faithfulness, self-sacrificial, and humble obedience to an authority is, of course, a virtue. And that's why Paul is using Abraham as an example of someone who was faithful to God, somebody who obeyed God. Let's go to verse 2 here. For if Abraham was justified by works of righteousness, prescribed by the law of Moses. And again, these words I have in red, they're not in the original text, but they're helping you to understand what he's talking about. For if Abraham was justified by works of righteousness prescribed by the Mosaic law, he has something to boast about, but not before God. Verse 3, for what does the scripture, say? Abraham was faithful to God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Put this down for a moment. You saw that I had in the blue text, for Abraham was faithful to God, and God recognized, accredited to him as righteousness. Well, that's not the way our New Testaments are translated. Our New Testaments were translated by Protestants who wanted to eliminate the necessity for external visible works. They were in full-fledged rebellion from Catholic authorities who required works. Roman Catholics required works. These Protestant rebels were eliminating works of any kind from the salvation plan that Luther invented and Tyndale ran with, and Calvin improved upon, and Zwingli improved upon. All these Protestant rebels said, no, you don't have to do anything to be right with God. You just have to think something. And now we have all these free grace fools out here today repeating that same lie from hell. You don't have to be faithful to God. You just have to believe something about God. Well, that was a lie 500 years ago, and it's a lie now. But one of the texts, their proof text, their most spurious proof text, is Romans 4:3 and Romans 4:5, where it seems to be talking about Abraham was justified by believing something, by trusting something. And my question is, what exactly did Abraham believe? As I pointed out before, he certainly did not believe in the promise of his progeny that he had received earlier in the text of Genesis, Genesis chapter 15. In fact, just before Genesis 15:6, God is promising Abraham that his offspring will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Well, like I said, as I observed, Genesis 12 and Genesis 16 tells us that Abraham did not believe these promises. He made sure that he would have his own progeny by his own efforts. Doesn't mean he disobeyed God. He simply didn't trust God. And there are lots of times when you and I may not necessarily believe that God has our best interest in mind, or he's paying full attention to us. But still we can obey him even when we're not so sure if he's paying attention. Well, that's what Abraham did. He obeyed God, but he didn't always believe everything he said. So when we see this text in Romans 4:3, where it says, and Abraham believed God, and God accredited to him as righteousness, mistranslation. The original Hebrew verb is transliterated aman. It is H539, and it is translated trustworthy, reliable, dependable. It's talking about someone who could be counted on, someone who was faithful. That's what it meant in Genesis 15:6. And the Protestants who translated it 1,500 years later played fast and loose and changed was faithful to believe. And if you doubt me, you have to answer the question, what exactly did Abraham believe? If you can't answer that question, and you cannot, then you have to admit that the translation was wrong. Abraham didn't believe God. Abraham obeyed God. And in fact, if you look in the Genesis text, Genesis 26, verses 4 and 5, where God tells Isaac why it is he's blessed, he tells Isaac that it's because your father Abraham kept my laws, obeyed my statutes. He was faithful. It doesn't say in Genesis 26, verses 4 and 5 that, Isaac, you're going to be blessed because your father Abraham was so gullible, was so credulous. He believed everything I told him. No, it doesn't say that. It says Abraham was righteous because he obeyed God. And that's what Romans chapter 4 is talking about. It's talking about It's offering us a paradigm of obedience. Well, righteousness with God without the law of Moses. That's who Paul is holding up to the church at Rome as an example of how you can be right with God without the law of Moses. Abraham and the faithfulness of Abraham, not the credibility, not the gullibility of Abraham, the faithfulness. Let's get back to it. Once again, Romans 4:3. But what does the scripture say? Abraham was faithful to God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Verse 4. Now, to one who works, wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as something due. But to one who does not work, and when he says work, he's not talking about any type of work. Again, this is an ex-Pharisee. He's talking about the righteous works demanded by the Torah. The one who does not work but obeys him who justifies the ungodly, such faithfulness is reckoned as righteousness. Look at this again, verse 5. But to one who does not work, again, work, what is he talking about work? He's talking about, as you would imagine, doing the ritual sacrifices when they are demanded. To one who does not work but obeys him. You see how I've obeys in blue? That's because the Protestant spin doctors once again use this G4100 verb pistuo. They translated that believes him who justifies the ungodly. But again, my question is, believes what? If you go with believes, you have to answer the question what. Every time you see that word believe, ask yourself, believe what? And if you can't answer that, if you have to add into it, you have to guess about it, it's because it's not talking about credence, it's talking about obedience. See how it works with obey? But to the one who does not work, but obeys him who justifies the ungodly. You don't have to eisegete anything into the text if you go with obeys. You do have to eisegete a lot into the text if you go with believes. You have to eisegete the content of the belief. And there's all kinds of questions then about what exactly the content of that is. There is no question if you go with obeys. But obeys him who justifies the ungodly, such faithfulness is reckoned as righteousness. All right, so verse 6 here. We got a total of 24 verses in this chapter. Quite enough here, I guess. So also David, King David, who also believed, David lived before there was a temple where atonement for sins can be done with ritual animal sacrifices. That's why Paul is using David here. He's citing David. There was no temple for David to do animal sacrifices to get right with God. So also David pronounces a blessing on those to whom God reckons righteousness apart from works. Again, apart from these animal sacrifices that, there is no temple until his son Solomon builds the temple. Verse 7, blessed are those whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one against whom the Lord will not reckon sin. Okay, so how does this, David, again, exists before there is a temple. And this, in the Old Testament, you got rid of sin, personal and national sin, at the temple with these ritual animal sacrifices. David couldn't do that. That's why he's held up, like Abraham, as another example of getting right with God without strict obedience to the law of Moses. Verse 9. Oop, a little too high. Is this blessing then pronounced only on the circumcised, that is, on those who had obeyed the Torah, or also on the uncircumcised? We say faithfulness was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. Again, you see how I have The fullness in blue there, we say faithfulness was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. And again, if you don't go with faithfulness, if you go with faith and you want to pretend it's talking about belief, trust, you need to spell out exactly what that faith is. You need to spell out what the trust is. You have to flesh out the content of what it is Abraham's trusting. And if you can't do that, you have to go with faithfulness, because you don't need to add anything to faithfulness, do you? We say faithfulness was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. And why shouldn't it be? Of course it should be. But faith? Why should gullibility be reckoned to anybody as righteousness? Why should credulity be considered a virtue? Well, it isn't a virtue. And that's not what Paul is talking about. And yet we Protestants have been trained to think that it was Abraham's ability to trust in things he could not personally verify. That's what made him righteous. No, not at all. It was his obedience. Okay. And the text, again, the Genesis text shows us Abraham does not disobey God. He doubts him, but he never disobeys him. Verse 10. How then was it reckoned to him? The righteousness, that is. He lived long before the law of Moses was given, so he's not going to be righteous from doing the works of the law of Moses. How then was Abraham made righteous? Was it before or after he had been circumcised, as the law commands? Paul says it was not after, but before he was circumcised. Okay, so Abraham is not righteous because he obeys the provision of circumcision. It says in Genesis 17, I think verse 24, that Abraham becomes circumcised at the age of 99. Well, that's not why he was righteous, because he was righteous before that. That's what Paul is saying. Paul says he received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faithfulness while he was still uncircumcised. And once again, every time you see this blue faithfulness, you think I'm taking liberties with the text? You think I'm adding something that doesn't belong there? Fine, take it away. Seal the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. Pretend that faith means trust. Again, I want to ask you, trust in what? Flesh it out for me. Tell me exactly what he was trusting. And then tell me why God thinks your trust is a virtue. I can tell you why faithfulness is a virtue. Can you tell me why trust is a virtue? No, you cannot. Don't even try. Moving on, the purpose was to make him, Abraham, the ancestor of all who are faithful to God without being circumcised, who don't have the law of Moses. We're not obliged to keep the law of Moses, and who thus have righteousness reckoned to them. Their righteousness is reckoned to them by their faithfulness, not because they adhered to the law of Moses. Likewise, the ancestor of the circumcised, that is the Jews, who are not only circumcised, but follow the example of the faithfulness that our ancestor Abraham had before he was circumcised. So again, Paul here is lifting up Abraham as an example of someone who's faithful to God, who's obeying God. He's not obeying the law of Moses, he's obeying God. And that's what he's saying now, that we are obeying a different law. We're obeying King Jesus, not the law of Moses anymore. That's not what gets you right with God, as he said in Romans chapter 3. You're not going to get right with God by obeying the law of Moses. You're going to get right with God by obeying God. And you obey him by giving allegiance to his son, the King, Jesus. All right. Verse 13, for the promise that he would inherit the world did not come to Abraham or to his descendants through the law of Moses, obviously, but through the righteousness of faithfulness. Through the righteousness of trust? No, the righteousness of faithfulness. For if it is the adherents of the law, again, of Moses, of course, who are to be the heirs, faithfulness is null. Again, change faithfulness that I have here, I put faith, change that to trust and see what sense it makes. It makes zero sense. Trust in what? Who are to be the heirs, faithfulness is null. And the promises about the descendants that Abraham would have is void. For the law brings wrath. But where there is no law, neither is there transgression. And Paul has just said that earlier in his letter to the Romans. Go back and look at 2:12 to 15 if you want. For this reason, the promise in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That is the promise Paul's talking about in verse 16. Depends on faithfulness in order that it may rest on grace. It sounds a little contradictory there. It depends on faithfulness in order that it may rest righteousness on grace. But what he's contrasting here is this righteousness comes from obedience, but not to the law of Moses. That's where if you're getting righteous by obeying the law of Moses, it's not grace because you're earning that. You're earning your righteousness by keeping the provisions of the law. But it's not, you don't have any law to obey. So it's God's gift that he's considering you righteous simply by obeying him, as he did Abraham. So that it may be guaranteed to all his descendants. All right. This promise is guaranteed to Abraham that he's going to have these descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, not because he obeyed the law of Moses, but because he was obedient to God. And that's, again, this is the paradigm of obedience that Paul is holding up to the Church of Rome, the patriarch Abraham. So that it may be, God's promised blessing may be guaranteed to all his descendants, not only to the adherents of the law, but also to those who share the faithfulness of Abraham, who's the father of all of us. All right, so we have the last 8 verses here. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations in the presence of the God to whom he gave allegiance. Of course, the Protestants translated gave allegiance as believed. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations in the presence of the God to whom he believed. Believed what? No. To whom he gave allegiance, of course, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. And he's showing here in the last verses of the chapter that Paul and Abraham was still faithful despite the obstacles, hoping against hope. Abraham, obeyed. Of course, the Protestants would obey, they translated that believe. Again, I ask, believe what? No, he obeyed, so that he would become the father of many nations. According to what was said, so shall your descendants be. Verse 19, he did not weaken in fidelity. Protestants put fidelity, they translate that faith. Again, he did not weaken in faith. What does that mean? He still believes something despite his doubts? No. He did not weaken in his obedience. He kept doing what he was told, even when it meant sacrificing his own son, Isaac. When he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old, and the barrenness of Sarah's womb. So he stayed faithful to God. He did what he was told, even before Sarah had any children. He was still obedient. However, in the promise of God, he did not waver in unfaithfulness. Original text is apistia. And Protestants, of course, translated that unbelief. I don't want to belabor the point. It's faithfulness, not belief. It's not credulity, it's fidelity. But he was strengthened in faithfulness as he gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. Up to verse 22. Therefore, it was reckoned to him as righteousness. His obedience was, not his credulity. Finally, here, the last three verses. Now, the words it was reckoned to him were written not for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be reckoned to us who give allegiance, not to us who believe, who give allegiance to him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, who was handed over for our trespasses, and who was raised for our justification. Verse 24 again. It will be reckoned to us who give allegiance to him who raised Jesus, our Lord, from the dead. Try the alternate translation. It will be reckoned to us who believe him who raised Jesus, our Lord, from the dead. It will be reckoned, righteousness will be reckoned to us who believe him. Believe what? No, not believe, obey. Obey him who raised Jesus, our Lord, from the dead. All right, well, that was quite a long-winded exposition. Sorry, I had to get through the whole chapter. I don't know, maybe I could have cut it down a little bit. Maybe next time I will. I think you know where I'm going with this. We have been trained to think that righteousness comes from thinking those right thoughts. And that's what it's all about. These Protestants were really the original easy believers. Sorry to say, I'm not a Roman Catholic. I'm not an Eastern Orthodox. I come from an evangelical background like you. But I must say, the more I read, the more I get into this, the more I realize just how fake our Bibles were. They were translated by ideologues with an agenda. And we really need to filter through them if we want to understand what the righteousness of God truly is. And it's not about gullibility. It's about fidelity. It was when Paul wrote this letter to the church at Rome, who, like I said, in a few years would undergo the most severe persecution. Abraham had his hard times. That's another reason why Paul lifts him up. David had his hard times. Again, he's talking to people who were obedient despite the trouble. He's not talking about people who had the ability to suspend disbelief and remain gullible about things. No. We Christians are not people, one of the criticisms that we believers have, and deservedly, I'll see Bill Maher and other critics of religion talk about how we are people of faith, which is another way of saying we are people of superstition. Well, yeah, if you translate that noun pistis, G4102, if you reflexively translate that noun as talking about trust and things that we cannot verify, then yeah, that charge that Christians are people of superstition, that charge rings true. But if you translate this noun the way I did in Romans 4, then people of faith are people of fidelity, despite the persecution. And that's not a vice, that's a virtue. People of superstition, that's not a virtue, That's a vice. All right, I'm going to leave it here. Look forward to the next one. Look forward to your feedback too. Have a good night, everyone.